Hey there, welcome to Mike's Collection, episode 167. I'm Mike, and the part of my collection that I'm going to be talking about today is my new Spawn action figures. And this is not a video that I really ever thought I'd be doing because I'd kind of given up on Spawn a few years ago. Just so you know, I'm a comic book collector, and I have been since I was 8 years old, back in the 80s. I started collecting comics just shortly before Todd McFarlane made his big splash into comic books. So I was reading and collecting Amazing Spider-Man at the time, and then he came in and he kind of just blew the lid off of things with his dynamic art style. I was a big fan of Todd McFarlane and his work on Spider-Man, as well as the other kind of hotshot young artists like Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee that were coming in at the time. And, I lived through it when all those big creators left Marvel Comics to go form their own company, Image Comics, which was a big gamble for them at the time. They all, started new series with their own, original creations. So, Rob Liefeld did Youngblood as well as a bunch of other things. Jim Lee did Wildcats. And Todd McFarlane did Spawn. And I was on board right from issue 1. I bought that first issue, off the spinner rack at my local comic book shop, and I collected it for years, for about 20 years or so, without missing an issue. Month after month after month, I collected Spawn comic books. And shortly after the Spawn comic book launched in 1992, Todd McFarlane launched his own toy company, McFarlane Toys. Originally Todd Toys, later McFarlane Toys, but that started around 1994, and he started producing his own Spawn action figures. And I was there at the beginning of that too. I bought the very first Spawn figure ever produced by McFarlane Toys. I still have it today. And he was producing some really cool figures. He really revolutionized the toy industry, probably even more so than he revolutionized the comic book industry. And, for a time there in the 90s, all the things I loved as a kid, they weren't making toys of anymore. There was really no more G.I. Joe. There was no more Transformers. There was no more He-Man. So Spawn was kind of the one-stop shop. This was new toys were being created of something that I loved. And so I collected Spawn toys for quite a few years. But as the years went on, I kind of started to lose interest in both the comic book and the toys. The comic seemed to lose focus. It started off as kind of a superhero comic book with big splashy colors and big action scenes like you'd expect to see in a Marvel comic book. But Todd seemed to want to steer it in this darker mystery horror direction. He'd often talk about it. He'd write in the back of the comic book saying how he wants to do another Spawn movie, but he wants it to be more like Seven, and Spawn is going to be more like just a shadowy entity in the background of the comic book and the movie. And it just... So he was pushing in one direction, and it wasn't really working, and there was still a lot of superhero-y elements, and it seemed disjointed. Other writers were coming on the book, and I stuck it out, like I said, for over 20 years. And then the toys, all those brands I mentioned that I loved, G.I. Joe, He-Man, Transformers, that stuff all came back in the 2000s, and there were so many cool toys being made by various companies that McFarlane's Toys, where they were the peak for a while, they started dropping down because I really liked my toys to be able to move. You could articulate them, pose them in different ways. And McFarlane's figures were more like statues, very rigid, very stiff. I kind of got away from that. Plus, I like my toys to be a little more brighter and colorful, and he was doing a lot of, he'd gotten away from Spawn, and he was doing a lot more stuff that were they looked almost photorealistic. So he was doing Walking Dead figures, and he was doing Halo figures. So the figures didn't move very much. They looked a lot like the actors. The colors of them were very matte colored, very flat, where I like big bright things like Marvel superheroes. So I stopped buying McFarlane Toys. Not 100%. I would still pick up the odd one here and there. But the big decision for me was dropping the Spawn comic book. It's very hard for me to stop collecting the comic book, especially one I've devoted so much time to. So I think it was around issue 270 that I stopped collecting Spawn. So 270 months in a row, approximately, I had bought Spawn, and then I stopped. And yeah, and so I didn't think, okay, I'm not buying Spawn figures, I'm not buying Spawn comic books. I still like the idea, the premise of the character. I was still excited for them to make a new Spawn movie. That's still supposed to happen at some point. But I just wasn't the same type of fan as I was before. But in the last couple of years, like the last year, 2 years maybe, my interest has kind of come back, which kind of surprised me. For one, the comic books seem to have a new lease on life. Todd McFarlane announced that he wanted to kind of expand the Spawn universe. He brought on a bunch of exciting writers and artists. And not only is there the core Spawn book, which there's always been, but now there's spin-offs called King Spawn and Gunslinger Spawn and The Scorched. And so you've got these like 4 different Spawn series, and they're all like, the storyline all kind of blend together, so you really kind of have to collect them all to get the storyline. I really like the art in the books. It's gone back to a little bit more the traditional comic book art that I like. It's not dark and painted and abstract. That stuff has its place. But for Spawn, I just wanted to get back to the bright, colorful colors that reminded me of, like, say, Todd McFarlane's art back in the day. And that's the direction that they're going. And they stopped making Spawn toys for so many years, like I said, focusing on Walking Dead, Halo. But he did a Kickstarter in 2019, I think it was, to bring back a big, awesome, deluxe Spawn figure that wasn't going to be available in stores. And I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I'm going to back that Kickstarter. So I bought 2 of his Kickstarter Spawn figures. They arrived, I got them last year in 2021. And yeah, they were great figures. Still a little too stiff for my liking, though, because on the Kickstarter, he kind of mentioned that they were going to be superposable. The cape was going to be removable. But then when I got them, the cape is not removable. And since it's this big cape that kind of drapes over the whole figure, it really hinders the articulation. You can't pose him or have him crouching on the side of a building. It's basically a statue, so I was a little bit disappointed about that. However, based on the success of that Kickstarter I backed, he decided to kick off a brand new line of Spawn action figures, the first one we'd had in years. And I was like, I don't think I'm going to get on board with this. I've already got Spawn. That's all I really need. I don't really want figures of the side characters, especially all the various versions of Spawn he can come up with, because that's one thing he did in the old line. He just kept making pirate Spawn or dinosaur Spawn or whatever. Like, you could make Spawn anything, and it just got a little out of control. So this time around, I thought, I've got the really nice Kickstarter Spawn statue. I don't really need the other figures. However, the problem with buying the comic book regularly again is it kind of makes you want the figures. So now that I'm reading Gunslinger Spawn, I thought, you know what, I'm going to get the new Gunslinger Spawn figure and check it out, because I don't actually have a Gunslinger Spawn in my collection from the old days. So I got this figure, and I haven't reviewed this yet. I've had it for a little while, and I still wasn't necessarily super impressed. It's not as statuesque as the other Spawn figure. This one's a little more like an action figure. He's got good posability and everything like that. But I still didn't think I was going to go, all in on the line. But I continued to read the comic books, and the first 2 issues of Scorched has been out now, and that's the team book. So all the side characters are together as a team, Gunslinger Spawn being one of them. Plus, I'm reading his solo book. But one of the other members of the Scorched is this character Redeemer, who I've always really liked the look of him. And they made a new version of him. I considered buying it. I didn't necessarily love the look of the figure, so I passed on it quite a few times. But now that I've read a couple issues of the Scorched, I'm like, I kind of want to build this whole team with modern action figures, so I better grab this Redeemer before it gets too hard to find. And the ads for, I can't even remember which book it is, if it's Spawn or King Spawn or whatever, but they've advertised that the character of Raven Spawn is going to be appearing in the comic books sometime soon. And Raven Spawn was one of my favorite Spawn action figures back in the 90s. I don't know if he's ever appeared in a comic book before. He may have, I can't recall. It's been many years. But anyway, the fact that they're bringing him back, it's either the first time ever or the first time in a very long time. And Raven Spawn is one of the other figures that McFarlane has released in this new Spawn line. It's still very early days. There's only about 6 or 7 figures released in the Spawn line so far. And so yeah, I already got Gunslinger. And the other day I went out and I picked up the Redeemer, and the Raven Spawn. So these guys, they look cool. There's some things that still seem a little wonky about them. Like, I don't know about the proportions of some of them. They seem to have like long torsos or something. And that's kind of what turned me off a little bit. But I thought, what the hell? I'm going to give these guys a try. After I open up these figures and really get a feel for them, then I'll have a good sense of what this toy line is going forward, and I can really decide if I want to pull the trigger and continue to buy Spawn figures, or maybe I'll just stop at these 3. Who knows? So anyway, why don't we pop these guys open and we'll take a look at them. So the first figure we're going to look at is Gunslinger Spawn, since I already had him outside of the box. And here you see him from head to toe. It's a very nice figure. There's lots of detail in the sculpting, which is great. This is really put McFarlane Toys on the map, is that they were so far ahead of other toy companies at the time when it came to sculpting. You know, they were one of the first companies, if not the very first company, that really kind of started making action figures for an adult audience. Like, they were intended to be adult collectibles rather than toys for children. So, you know, the focus was less on playability and more about displaying a cool figure. So they still display very well. It's a pretty large figure, which makes it hard for me to fit the whole thing on camera, because I just don't have a whole lot of room to work with on this table that I use for these videos. So yeah, I got to push them way back here to get them all on camera. And that's the first kind of complaint I have about this figure. I'm going to talk about the scale a little bit. McFarlane has always had kind of a weird scale for their figures. Like, if I bring that original Spawn figure out here again for a second. So this is about a 5-inch scale figure, and it's a pretty reasonable figure. He fit in pretty well with, say, your Toy Biz Marvel figures. You know, he wouldn't look at a place next to a Ninja Turtle or something, say. So, you know, he was in scale with those other figures. So if you got this when you were a kid and you wanted to play with those other toys, it kind of worked. But you can still see with these toys, the very first wave of Spawn toys, McFarlane hadn't quite went into the like adult collectible market yet. He was still kind of straddling the line a little bit. So this toy, you know, it's not super detailed. It's not super articulated. Like, he's kind of simple. He's got a bit of a cartoony, toyish look to him. That's something they got away from quite quickly, and they started making much darker, you know, less posable toys. And when he started getting into the collectible market, he seemed less concerned with having it pair up with other action figures. If anything, he seemed to almost consciously strive to make it not line up with your other action figures. So I know I talked about him doing other toy lines like Walking Dead. So when he was doing Walking Dead and Halo figures, they came out in this scale. And this is, I don't know what you call this, maybe about 4.5 inch scale. So this here is Zombie Merle, by the way. Cool figure. But if you wanted to merge that figure with, say, your G.I. Joes that are in the 3 3/4 to 4 inch scale, and you're like, yeah, it'd be cool to have the Joes have to fight a zombie apocalypse or anything, you get your G.I. Joes, and you can see how the scale is off. You know, even with Flint on a display base here, he's still substantially shorter than your Walking Dead figures or your Halo figures. Like, this is a scale all its own. So you really couldn't use those figures with anything else. They were just too big for G.I. Joes. But if you brought in, say, a 6-inch figure, like Spider-Man here from Marvel Legends, he's just way too small. So that was a really awkward size. Anyway, now that McFarlane is making Spawn figures again, and he has the license to DC, again, he went with a really weird scale. I like some of McFarlane's DC figures, and I probably would buy more if the scale wasn't so off. I have a lot of DC figures that came from like DC Direct, some from Mattel, and those guys fit in pretty well with your Marvel Legends. So, you know, you can display Spider-Man next to Superman, and it doesn't look weird. It looks like they could have come from the same universe. But now you see with Gunslinger Spawn, compared to Spider-Man, like, I was going to say this line is a 7-inch line, but compared to Spidey here, he looks, you know, at least 2 inches taller. And with the hat, even more so. Like, these guys don't look like they belong in the same universe at all. And I I think people like consistency on their shelves, not just so I could play with these together, but just when I stand Spider-Man next to Spawn, I want them to all seem like a consistent size. You know, again, here's a 6-inch G.I. Joe from the Classified series. He fits in well with Spider-Man. If I bring in Evelyn here from the Masters of the Universe Revelation line, she fits in. Like, these three characters can interact, but Gunslinger Spawn, no, he's like a freaky giant, and he really doesn't belong in here. So, you know, on its own, the scale doesn't really matter, but collectors like myself, we're a fickle bunch. We like consistency, and I really don't know why Spawn figures have to be so awkwardly tall. And I think the DC figures being awkwardly tall is an even bigger offense. Because I'm okay with having Spawn but it be its own thing, but I think people really want their superheroes from the big two companies to be able to stand next to each other. So the fact that your DC figures kind of tower over your Marvel figures, I find it frustrating, and it keeps me from buying more figures than I would. Anyway, so that's it about the scale. It's tall. Sculpting, no complaints here. He looks great. So you see here his hat with all these little skulls sculpted on it. You know, he ends up looking like Slash. That is sculpted to the head. The hat is not removable. And also he's got this overcoat. You know, it's got some give to it. It's soft rubber, so you can move it around and pose it. But it is also not removable, at least not easily. You know, and the sleeves are a separate sculpt. So even if you got this coat off, he'd end up with red arms from a jacket. So that's not really removable either. Now, he does have this, I don't know what you call it. So his shotgun holster, you know, strapped around his torso. So that is removable. That was an accessory that I had to add on there. I don't think that was on him when I first opened up the packaging. Shotgun fits in there quite nicely, and there's some nice sculpted detail throughout on the gun. And it's nice that it's two-toned. It's not just silver or just brown or black. So I really appreciate when they paint the accessories up like that. So besides the shotgun, he's also got his twin pistols here. Again, they're the same two tones. There's the little sculpted detail. You see the skulls kind of screaming there in the handle. So very cool. And they can be holstered in his belt. This one's kind of fallen out of his hand. But yeah, so you can holster both of these in here if you like. Like so. And yeah, so let's take a look at the rest of the sculpted detail here. He's got the bullet belts there, looks great. All these pouches, little knife there, that's part of the sculpt, that's not removable. Yeah, just great stuff. The spurs there. Again, no complaints about the sculpt. Looks really cool, I like him a lot. Now, one thing I'll mention while I was handling him there, you know, you don't want your spikes to be too soft and gummy. But these are kind of spiky. Like, so when I'm handling them, you gotta kind of be careful. That kind of hurts your fingers to be touching these little plastic spikes. They are kind of sharp. And he's got spikes kind of all over him. So on his shoulders, around his arm, on his legs. So yeah, be careful when you're handling him. The other accessory I'll mention, he's got that little Spawn base. All these figures come with the same little circular base. I think it's the same little circular base that came with the Kickstarter Spawn figures. And it serves its purpose. Like, he doesn't quite fit on there, both of his feet. Like, I don't know why McFarlane decides to go with these smaller bases. You'd think a figure this tall would have, like, a wider rectangular base. Like, I happen to have an Action Force base handy here for the Action Force 6-inch figures, and that would make more sense when you got two pegs. Because this one, you see there's only one peg on the disc, even though he's got holes in both of his feet. So something like this would make more sense to me. But whatever, this is what McFarlane's given us, so we've got the circular disc with the Spawn logo. So the other thing I want to talk about, I guess I'll quickly mention paint apps. Again, no problems there. And rarely was that ever an issue with McFarlane Toys. You know, with he doesn't skimp on the details. You've got the gold there, you know, all these little details are painted. On other toy lines, you might have seen a lot of this stuff just all cast in one color. But yeah, McFarlane always makes sure to paint everything. It looks really nice. No issues there. So articulation, that was the other big problem I had with toys of the 90s from McFarlane Toys, is they were like statues. Like, I have a Spawn figure that's literally, his leg is up. Has a little stiff. But anyway, I have a Spawn figure where his knee is bent like this, and he's got his foot rested on a pile of skulls. And you can't unbend his knee. You can take him off of the pile of skulls, but his leg is stuck in that kind of like 90-degree bend. And so you could never really play with it or have him fighting anybody. Same as there was a Spawn figure where he's sitting in a throne of skulls. You could lift him up out of the throne, but you can't make him in a standing position. So you've got this sitting Spawn. So again, they weren't really action figures. They were really more statues. Anyway, so this is an improvement because the figures, you see he's got a ball jointed shoulder. So good range movement on the arm. Goes all around. Goes out. The elbow. And there's a double jointed elbow there. That means he's going to drop his gun here. But so the arm kind of almost has like a double fold to it. So it bends once there. And then with that other rivet, it kind of bends in even more. So good range there. The wrist, it swivels there as well. The head, it's on a ball joint, so you can spin that all around if you want to. Good range there. The other arms, same thing. Now he's got the ab crunch, and that's pretty well hidden there. So he can turn at the waist. It's kind of hindered by the jacket. He can't get much of a turn there. He's got another kind of joint right there at his waist. It's kind of hard to see with the bullet belt, but again, he gets very little movement from there because of the jacket. The legs. So he's got good range there. He can do splits. He's got a double jointed knee. So let's see. I'm not going to force it, but you can see, so he can bend that far back, and then this joint should be able to, he should basically be able to kick himself in the ass with his spur. So I'm sure it can do that. I just don't really want to mess with it. And it's hard to hold on to because of all these spikes. It hurts to press too hard on this figure. So pretty good range of movement. He still doesn't move, like his legs don't move forward very well. Like if I want to have him kick somebody in the face, you can see it's kind of hindered there. So, you know, there's the illusion of a lot of posability, but you still can't really make him squat very well or sit. Like he's still kind of rigid. And that's what I was kind of complaining about in my intro. Because I bought this figure a little while ago. This was kind of me testing the waters to see if I wanted to get into the Spawn figures. He looks cool. Still a little rigid. So I was going to maybe back off. But it was really my the fact that I'm a fan of the comic book again these days that makes me want to continue to buy these figures. So yeah, there's not much more to say about Gunslinger Spawn. This is my first Gunslinger. This was a character... and I'm just going to kind of talk off the cuff here, so don't quote me on this. I don't know if this is necessarily fact. I'm not sure where this character first appeared. I believe he first appeared in the toy line, because that was the thing. The Spawn comic back in the 90s and the early 2000s focused on just the one main Spawn, Al Simmons, but the toy line was putting out new waves, you know, a couple times a year. And so in order to have a Spawn in every wave, the same way you want a Batman figure in every wave of Batman figures, McFarlane was just coming up with weird and wonderful designs like Cowboy Spawn here, Pirate Spawn, like I mentioned earlier, Techno Spawn, all kinds of things like that. So I'm pretty sure Gunslinger Spawn first appeared as the toy, which I never had. To be honest, that was one of the Spawns where it seemed like kind of lazy to me. I wanted Spawns that felt like other characters. But this guy here, it basically looks like regular Spawn with a cowboy hat and a coat. And the coat is pretty reminiscent of the cape that regular Spawn wears anyway. So like when this guy takes his hat off, like how do you know this isn't just regular Spawn? Like so I always felt that was kind of a lazy way to do a new character. So I passed on that Spawn initially. And I don't know how many times they might have redid that figure. I think they redid it again as a 12-inch figure later. But I'm not sure. They might have done a couple of versions in the 6 inches. I believe Gunslinger Spawn did appear in the Spawn comic book for maybe an issue or two as kind of a flashback tale. They used to do that sometimes, flashback to older Spawns. But he never had a prominent starring role until just this past year, where he's been made a member of the Scorched team. So, cool character. And, you know, I think it's a cool look. It's not the most original look, but it's really the fact that this character has been fleshed out in the comic books as of late that made me buy this toy. And yeah, I think these are still great price too. That's the other thing. McFarlane Toys, even though they're bigger and more detailed, they're still more affordable than pretty much anything else on the market. It's cheaper than a Marvel Legend, than a Star Wars Black Series, than a G.I. Joe Classified. So yeah, if if money is one of your primary concerns when buying figures, then McFarlane's DC and Spawn figures is a good line to get into. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. So here is the Redeemer outside of the box. And again, he's a very big figure. Height-wise, he's about the same as Gunslinger Spawn. Gunslinger is a little taller with the hat, but you can see how these characters look like they belong in the same universe. But again, put Spidey in here, and then he's just freakishly small. Or these guys are freakishly big. Anyway, so again, large figure, but at least they're to scale with one another, which is the main thing, I suppose. Cool looking character. Again, great sculpt on this guy. The wings look great. The paint looks great. All the kind of ornate detail in his chest armor there. Very cool. And this is probably my favorite Spawn. I guess you'd call him a villain. He started out as a villain. And even now, him and Spawn, I think, are still, them working together is probably not going to last. Spawn is kind of from hell, even though he doesn't really follow hell's orders. And Redeemer is kind of his opposite in that he's from heaven, although he tends to not necessarily follow heaven's orders either. And when he was first introduced in the comic books way back in the day, his name was, I believe they introduced him as Anti-Spawn. He had a little bit of a different look. And then he's come back a couple of times. I think he's been killed a couple of times, and he's come back. And the thing is, heaven is able to basically empower different human beings with the power of the Redeemer. So there's been a different human host over the years. I don't even remember who the current host is. I don't even know if we're supposed to know. It was a kid for a while. It might still be. I don't know. I have a hard time keeping track of all this stuff. But he's always been a very cool looking character, even through all the different incarnations and changes from when he used to wear a cape to when he had wings and all that stuff. So very cool. And there have been a number of Redeemer figures over the years. The only Redeemer figure that I've ever had and that I have right now is this one, which is kind of odd. So this is a line of figures that McFarlane Toys put out a few years ago that were based on an animated look, if there was an animated Spawn, kind of like Saturday morning cartoon, even though there never was. So these guys are bright and colorful and stylized. The proportions are exaggerated. I have a handful of figures from this line, and I think they're awesome. This actually kind of got me back into buying Spawn figures after I hadn't bought any for a number of years. I thought this line was just really cool looking. So very limited movement. You see he's got his wings aren't nearly as elaborate here, but they don't move at all. These guys have much bigger display bases, which is nice, because these wings definitely make the figure a little top heavy, and the display base helps to make sure he's not falling over. Now, the Redeemer here has always had a big sword. So you see I've got him holding his backwards, because I think that's the only way I could really get him. He's not even holding it. He's got closed fists, so I've got his hand kind of tucked around it there. He's got an open hand there, so there's probably a way to get the sword in there, but I don't think I ever figured out how to do it. Anyway, cool looking figure, and you can see how the look has carried over quite nicely into this new version. Anyway, let's get rid of him, and we'll focus on the new one. So let's get a closer look at him. So again, really cool detail on this guy. And again, he's sharp. He's not quite as sharp as Gunslinger Spawn, but he just still has some of those spikes. But yeah, so really cool sculpting in here. And even though these pieces aren't all painted, I think this is true to the look in the comic book. You don't need those to be a different color. This is all supposed to be just kind of carved into gold there. The sword looks nice with that black wash to bring out some of the detail. But lots of nice sculpted detail in the sword and the blade and the handle. So yeah, just a really cool looking figure. So I mentioned in the intro that I saw this figure around for a little while and I passed on it. Now actually, before I'd even seen any of these Spawn figures in store, this was the first one I had pre-ordered, and I pre-ordered it from Big Bad Toy Store online, where I buy a lot of my stuff. Except they had two versions available. They had this blue and gold one, which is his standard look, and then they had another one where the blue was black and the gold is silver. And I think they called that Dark Redeemer. And I wasn't really sure what that was. I didn't know if that was a new look that the character was going to have, or it was just a weird paint variant. But I thought, well, you know what? I've already got a Redeemer in blue and gold in my collection with the animated one. So I'm going to go with the Dark Spawn. So I pre-ordered that, and I had it available for pre-order for a while. But then I saw this guy in stores, and I looked at him, and I thought he just looked kind of weird. The proportions seemed off. The way he was posed in the box, his torso just looked really long to me, and like everything about him. I find the crotch piece seems a little long, the legs seemed a little long. Something about the proportions just wasn't sitting right with me, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to cancel my pre-order of the Dark Redeemer, and I'm just not going to bother with him. But once I started reading the Scorched series, and I was like, okay, now I do want this guy. Rather than pre-order him and wait, potentially months to get that black and gray one, I just went out and I bought this one from my local GameStop. And I don't know what it is, but now that I have him out of the box, his proportions don't really seem to bother me. It bothers me that he's too tall, like all the Spawn figures. But otherwise, there's nothing about him that really... he doesn't seem so awkwardly long in the torso like he used to. That was a major issue with this guy, too, is that when I first got him, I thought, why is his torso so long? But I think it just takes some getting used to the height of these figures. But I really don't think their torsos are as disproportionate as I initially thought. So I'm actually fine with the proportions on this guy. One thing that is frustrating with him, you might notice I'm having a little trouble with him toppling over, is because these wings are really heavy, and his joints and his ankles are a little loose. If they were a nice, solid ratchet joint, I might be able to find a pose and leave him there. But as it stands, I worry that his ankle or his knee is going to give out, and he's just going to topple over. So that's a little tricky. This, again, would have helped if there was a better display base. Something like this would have made more sense. But it seems like McFarlane is just going to stick with these single peg little discs that can barely hold the figure on there. But it kind of works. If you put this guy in a display case, you could probably find a good pose where he'll balance. Anyway, so we've already talked about the sword. The only other accessory, if you want to call it that, are his wings. They were separate pieces in the packaging. You have to plug them into his back there. But you can see there is a ball joint on them, so these guys do move. So you can kind of crank those up a little bit. I'm actually a little nervous about moving them around too much. McFarlane Toys seem to generally be pretty good quality-wise, but I am a little nervous. But yeah, you can move these around up and down a little bit and back and forth. I won't go over all the articulation again because he seems to be pretty much the same as Gunslinger Spawn. Double jointed elbows, double jointed knees. He still struggles to kick ahead too much, but that's not too bad. That's better than Gunslinger. But yeah, and I don't know if I mentioned the ankles on the other figure too, but they've got a good range of movement on the ankles. So yeah, cool figure. I like the look of him. Once I got him out of the package, I liked him better than I expected. And I'm actually considering now going back and pre-ordering the black and silver one as well, because I think that's actually going to end up being a different character. So you're going to have this gold and blue Redeemer on the good guy team, the Scorched, essentially, and then the Dark Redeemer is a different character working for the bad guys. So yeah, especially if that's the case. Because if it was just a costume change, I'd feel less compelled. But if they're different characters, then yeah, I'm going to end up wanting them both, because this ends up as a pretty solid figure when all's said and done. So yeah, pretty cool. So lastly, we're going to take a look at Raven Spawn outside of the box. Pretty cool looking. Scale-wise, he's right up there with everybody else. So, Gunslinger's taller by a hat, but otherwise, these guys, they work well together. And before I get rid of Gunslinger Spawn, this is what I'm talking about with when in the 90s, when McFarlane was making all these varieties of Spawn figures. And I know I referred to him as one of my favorite 90s Spawns earlier. I think he actually came out in the early 2000s, like 2001, 2002. Again, I'm not entirely sure, but it was pretty early on. Anyway, this is what I'm talking about with this being a lazy Spawn, because he looks a lot like this guy, the standard Spawn, just with like a hat and a coat on, whereas this guy does not. This looks like a different character. The only real similarities are that he's got kind of a burned up, charred face with those glowing green eyes that all spawns have. That, you know, shows that they have that necro energy flowing through them. But otherwise, he's got a unique look. And so that was important to me. I liked characters that felt like other characters. So in the old days, whether it was the 90s or the early 2000s, this was one of the characters I actually bought as opposed to the Gunslinger there. So I've got the original Raven Spawn figure here. So let me move some things around. So here is the original Raven Spawn. And I still think this guy's a super cool figure. I actually got rid of quite a few of my McFarlane Toys years ago, and I still have a lot of them in storage, but this is one of the few figures that I kind of have always kept on display. I always just thought he looked really cool. Like, his colors are very muted. He's all just kind of gray and brown, but a lot of detail in there. He looks very dark, very scary, very creepy, very spiky, and I just always loved this dude. It's a very cool figure, and I think this guy does him justice. I don't like his color scheme quite as much, but it works with this new line of figures. As I mentioned, all of McFarlane Toys for a good 20 years were always very kind of matte looking. They didn't have that same sleek sheen as, say, a Marvel figure. But with this new line of Spawn figures, they're kind of leaning more towards the slicker look. And I actually like that. They feel a little bit more like toys and a little less like collector pieces. So yeah, if you are somebody that just wants this to look like a really impressive collectible in a cabinet, you might prefer the original one. I think this is a little darker and more grown-up looking. Whereas this guy, just his colors and the way it reflects light, it's a little shinier, a little smoother. This one looks more like a toy. But I actually find that appealing. So both are cool. I think this looks cooler. But as far as a toy go and the value, this guy's probably expensive to track down on the secondary market now. I don't know. But yeah, very cool. I think they did re-release another version of him later that was even more, it was less posable, so it was more like a statue. And it was a cool one too that had him displaying this big curved hook, which similar to these little things that are dangling from him. But this old figure, the only weapon he had was this kind of, I guess you call it an axe. So this version here, the new one, it comes with that same axe. Maybe a little different in the sculpted detail. But he came with another accessory as well, which seems to kind of harken back to the second version of this figure that was released back in the day. And that is this big, crazy curved hook. And it's connected to a smaller hook on a chain. So that's cool. He can hold onto this accessory too. He can hold one in each hand. I don't like how the chain is sculpted like that. I'd rather it was kind of a free hanging chain. But no big deal. Also, I'll mention this guy came with the same display base that everybody else did. So yeah, that's another thing with his chain. So you see he's got those two kind of meat hooks hanging off of, but that's just a soft rubber. So they don't really move realistically, which is in line with him being more like a toy as opposed to this guy who's a little bit more like an adult collectible, but each of the links on the chain are actually sculpted separately here. So those move much more like a real chain. They kind of get caught up on things. So I definitely prefer this look, but yeah, what are you going to do? This probably helps saves on cost and it still looks cool. So before I get rid of the comparison here, I actually do have another Raven Spawn. So I did not get the version 2, but I did get the animated look when they put that out. And you can see they changed him up quite a bit. His colors are obviously much brighter and more cartoony now, because if you're imagining these guys in a Saturday morning cartoon, this guy probably would have scared the shit out of kids. This guy here, he's a little more, easy to take. He's still probably pretty scary, but he's got that skull-like face. He's got those two big curved meat hooks, we'll call them. Really cool boots. I like how he has the one big boot, kind of like the regular Spawn has one big large boot. Very cool. But another thing that's kind of interesting is you can actually take his cowl off. And there you get a closer look at his kind of zombie-like head. So very cool. Anyway, let's get rid of these guys and just focus on the new one. So yeah, I think this new Raven Spawn from McFarlane Toys is very cool. And if you're a Spawn fan, this is definitely one you might want to seek out. Despite the fact that he's a little more, softer rubber and a little more toy-like, he's still very, dark and creepy. They didn't, Saturday morning him up the way they did the animated style one. Like, this guy is still a dark, creepy character with lots of kind of gross skull details. Like, it makes you wonder, is this, real souls that are sucked into his armor or something? Like, it looks kind of like the cover of the Necronomicon from the Evil Dead movies or something. Like, is this living things or once living things all over his body? I don't know. It's just a creepy looking dude. The cape is soft rubber. You can kind of see what's going on under there. It's just like plated armor. Spiky. These spikes are pretty soft. They don't hurt to touch too much. But yeah, articulation wise, everything we've seen already. So he's got that, he spins at the waist, just above the belt, but he's also got that ab crunch there, which is hidden well in the plated armor. So that's where you get the most movement there. As far as the kick, okay, he's got a pretty nice kick. And he's actually got articulated toes even. So that gives you lots of posing options. And he's still got the double jointed knee. So really good range of movement there. Get that back a little bit. Actually, that seems to be about as far back as I can get him right now. But they are double jointed, so they probably do go back farther than that. Yeah, there we go. So there, that gives you an idea of how far back his leg can go. Yep, so you can get him in some nice crouching poses and stuff. So pretty cool. I like this guy quite a bit. And now that I've had a chance to fiddle around with all three of these guys a little bit, I don't think this bodes well for my wallet, because I think I might want to get some more of these McFarlane Spawn figures. Like, from the Wave 1 figures, the other ones that are currently available in stores are the Clown, who I don't necessarily love. I never really liked the design of the Clown, so I'll probably pass on him. But there is a new Violator figure that's about $70. It is a big hulking figure, and I was thinking I would pass on that because I always liked the classic skinny Violator design. But now that I'm enjoying these figures so much, I think I might want to give that Violator a try. So I may have to pick him up. And yeah, they've already shown some Wave 2 figures like Spawn and Cygor, and yeah, that other version of the Dark Redeemer. So yeah, there's definitely probably going to be some more Spawn figures in my future. Okay, so that is my review of my latest Spawn action figures from McFarlane Toys. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave me some comments below. So yeah, I appreciate you watching. I will see you again soon with another video. Until then, have a good one. Ciao.